Hello and welcome back, and today we're going to be revisiting the subject of the WD Black NVMe SSD, released a little over a year ago now. This SSD at the time was one of the very few PCIe Gen 4x4 M.2 NVMe's available on the market that could knock out 7,000 megs. But times changed, the industry moves forward, and 1 year later this SSD still exists and is still very competitive, but in a much more crowded marketplace. And in today's video, much like our review that we did about a year ago, we're going to be re-reviewing this drive. We're going to be looking at it not only with its own merits, what it's got, but we've got to look at how things have changed in the last year and whether right now the WD Black SN850 is still a competitive SSD at the end of 2021. Roll the credits. Now, of all the things that have changed in the market right now in terms of M.2 PCIe Gen 4x4 SSDs, one of the biggest things that has changed, not only with this drive, but in terms of NVMe technology in general, when we look at all of these different NVMe's, is the price. The price point of these SSDs, like most technology, when it first arrives to a little bit later on and the tech moves forward, it becomes a little bit more affordable. The baseline expectations of what we get for our money do change quite rapidly. Now, in the case of the WD Black, when it was launched a year ago, it was available in 3 different capacities: a 500 gig, a 1 TB and a 2 TB. These were priced at a staggering $149, $229 and $449. Again, right there at the end, close to $500 in dollars for 2 TB drives. I hate seagulls. Now, things have changed rapidly since then, and one of the reasons for that is because it's been in the market for a lot longer than most other SSD brands out there, and WD, like a small handful of drive SSD manufacturers, does all of their stuff almost exclusively in-house. The result is they have a greater deal of control about availability and pricing and how much they pay and how much they can charge for the overall package of their SSDs. Now, it's worth highlighting, without the heatsink, this SSD knocks around now for $94 for the 500 gig. That is a drop of $50 on that first unit in a year, $165 and $379. Those are enormous drops for each of those capacities. Now, that is, of course, to make it competitive against other SSDs that have been released in the last 12 months or so, but still, nonetheless, it makes it still one of the most affordable SSDs, despite it arriving a year ago being one of the most expensive. Now, I mentioned about the heatsink. The one we're looking at here is the heatsink version. It's the one that we've been utilising for our PS5 testing. Now, the heatsink is important for 2 reasons. One, because NVMe's, particularly PCIe Gen 4x4 SSDs, the ones that are going to have a lot of activity, more predominantly write activity than read, these are SSDs that are going to get quite hot. Now, WD and the heatsink on their SSDs is one of the very best heatsinks in the market. It's so well crafted. I've talked about it before, and in our early temperature testing as well as the temp testing within PS5. It's very well constructed. It's a single metal piece, but it is ventilated all the way through. We also have the thermal padding you can just make out there on top of the chips that cover each of the important components. So shying away slightly in terms of coverage of the NAND, which you want to get warm, but putting ample coverage there over the controller inside that WD Black G2. Now, it's a complete contained solution, so it's base and top of the SSD all the way around. And as heatsinks go, as I say, it's one of the best out there. It's also not one of the cheapest either. The heatsink version of this drive is noticeably higher when you shop around. Depending on the site you go to, you will end up spending a significant chunk of change, and particularly you're probably going to end up paying some of those release prices more than ever, because the heatsink version of this drive is particularly in high demand. And if you do see it on offer in your local e-shop, your Amazons or whatever, try to make sure you get the heatsink version if it's not going to break your bank account, because honestly, when it comes to deployment, particularly in PC environments, but also console, It's one of the best heatsinks out there, and I think worth the money. How much, though, is up to you there. Now, I touched on a controller there earlier on, the G2. That is one of WD's in-house NVMe controllers. They've got the SN controller and they've got this G controller. With this, they got it right very early doors, able to provide that 7,000 megabytes per second sequential read right there at the start, at the end of 2020. And again, write performance is, and of course we are talking about sequential, by the way, so big data isn't quite so high. I think if there's one thing that the last 12 months has really bestowed on modern NVMe SSDs at the Gen 4 level, it's read. They're sort of keeping the ball in the air at 7,000 and added the odd 100 megs here or there along the way. But write performance has improved significantly in the last 12 months. With this SSD arriving at the 500 gig 1TB and 2TB level, arriving at 4,100, 5,300 and 5,100 sequential megabytes per second right at the 500 1TB and 2TB drive. Now, given that 1 and 2TB drives in the market right now are able to push out 6,000, even reaching heights of 6,800 megabytes per second on drives like the Firecuda series and the likes of the Gamix series, those SSDs in that extra time have been able to facilitate that write performance extra in a way that the WD, that's one of the few areas where I would say it has a weakness 1 year on since its release. Another thing I will highlight, the NAND being utilised in Seagate's BICS, BICS 3D TLC NAND inside there, 96 layer NAND being utilised in here. This is the 1TB model, and it's single-sided. It's 2 NAND modules of 512 gig, which is great for read performance, but that's one of the areas that I think is hampering that write performance. We're seeing a lot of manufacturers, in order to up a lot of that performance, distributing that NAND in 4 cells, even on the 1TB, so 4 times 256 gig NAND cells there, meaning that write performance can be improved upon as the performance is kind of spread across more NAND cells in unison. It also arrives with DDR4 memory on board, again something that's fairly standard now a year later, at 512 gig on the lowest capacity there, and 1 and 2 gigabyte, 512 meg on the 500 gig model, and 1 gig and 2 gig of DDR4 memory on the 1TB and 2TB respectively there. So lovely performance all the way through. Again, do make sure that you are going to update the firmware on this drive, whether you buy it or you're still going to sit on the fence. In a lot of SSDs, I will always recommend on the first installation day there, you make sure to go to the respective brand website, and I will be going through it in the test area later on. Make sure you download the relevant tools to install the firmware update on these, but in particular, drives like the WD Black. Because the WD Black SN850 series, the SN750, had a few bumps on the road recently in terms of cache over saturation. But in the WD Black 850, because it was released a year ago, there have been numerous updates. Do download the WD Dashboard program, something I'll be showing you in the test later on to show you that this drive's up to date. And if it's not, update that firmware there for you. And that will ensure you get the best possible performance, as a year of R&D have improved what drives like this can do. And that's how it still remains competitive, not just for its price, but in other performance ways, even 1 year since its initial release. Again, when we talk about performance, we can talk about IOPS there, and at 4K IOPS, it was able to crack the 1 mil IOPS there at 4K IOPS, of course, in read, and that is on the 1 and the 2TB respectively. So with 1 million 4K read IOPS on the 1TB and the 2TB, and 7,000, just over, I think 700,000 on the 1TB and the 2TB, and of course the 500 gig there, with lesser components to play with there in terms of NAND, you get the performance scaled accordingly, 800 over 550, 570,000 IOPS there, read, write 4K respectively. So again, it's got great read performance through the nose. It's just that write performance a year on that's a little lower. Now, if you're considering this exclusively for gaming, you know, your PS5, your PC, write performance, it's going to be very low on the priority list there. It's going to work absolutely fine because you're predominantly going to be doing read activities, and what little write activity you do are going to be very infrequent. It's going to be transfer a bunch of data over, or download to your Steam library, or migrate over from an internal PS5 SSD to the internal or from the PSN, and then everything else is read, with very little write activity going on there. So again, what little write barriers there are a year on this drive are not going to present too much of a challenge. Last thing to touch on before we move to the test area to retest this drive is going to be the subject of endurance. This drive arrives with a 0.3 drive writes per day rating, so that's 300 terabytes, 600 terabytes, and 1200 terabytes on the 500 gig, 1 TB, and 2 TB respectively, within that 5-year warranty cycle, which is good. Don't get me wrong, and again, that goes back to how much write you're going to do on this. I would say that the bulk of PCIe Gen 4x4 SSDs that have been released by pretty much every brand under the sun in the 12 months since this was released, the bulk of them live at around 0.3 to 0.4 drive writes per day, DWPD, but a few have come onto the scene with higher ratings. There's a lot of them, I've already talked about 5 or 6 here on the channel that have taken advantage of different controllers, such as the Phison, which again wasn't really knocking around the Phison E18 when this was released, and that InnoGrit Rainer controller, the IG5236. Those have done a lot with not only the performance, but managing anti-wear internally, and therefore a lot of these drives read 0.5 and 0.7 drive writes per day, despite them having that high read in the 7000s and even high write in the late 6000s there. That's something that's changed a lot in the year since this drive first came to market. And talking about that NAND, it's worth highlighting again, 96 layer NAND is very, very good, and right now, a year since its release, is pretty much on par with 90% of the SSDs out there. But we're seeing a lot more SSDs arriving in this second half of 2021 with 176 layer NAND. That is assisting performance, that is assisting durability, and ultimately making those drives higher performing. Yes, their price tags are higher because of it. That's one of the factors that's keeping some SSDs more expensive than others. I'm looking at you, Firecuda 530, but still, nonetheless, it's a great SSD, at least as far as the datasheets go, 1 year since its release. But that's enough talk. Let's get this SSD in that test machine. Let's see if it still lives up 1 year on to those performances, and have there been improvements in the firmware in that time, and ultimately decide whether this is still worth your money and your data 1 year since release. Let's go. Okay, so we've made our way onto the desktop of my test machine here. As you can see there, Crystal Disk has found the drive. We are taking advantage of that WD Black drive there. As you can see, NVMe 1.4 using the PCIe 4x4 lane there. Before I get on with the testing, I know a lot of you might be coming into the subject of SSDs, particularly for gaming, quite new. And also this is a 1-year-old SSD, so I thought I would include a couple of extra little bits here showing you the best way to set the drive up for the first time, as well as check your firmware and updating it very quickly. If you already know this, skip forward about 3 or 4 minutes, but otherwise head over to the WD website and download the WD dashboard tool, or just look up on Google WD Black SN850 firmware. This will give it to you, and this is a real-time tool that allows you to upgrade your firmware very, very quickly, as well as kind of tailor a lot of things, whether you want to switch to a gaming mode, whether you want to enhance the performance or the internal operations around deleting with trim. All of these are things that you can enable. I'm not going to enable any extra features. As you can see, trim isn't being utilized here because of the volume, but ultimately that is a great little tool that I recommend you use, and updating the firmware is incredibly quick and easy and straightforward. You just go straight into tools, find the firmware thing, check for updates, and if there is an update available, it'll allow you to do it. Just make sure you have your data backed up, because it may format your drive, and particularly if it's a big amount of updates in between. Next thing I'm going to do is make sure I add this drive. For those that don't know how to add a drive as a secondary drive on their Windows system, open up this PC or my computer, click the computer tab and select Manage. From Manage, it will open up a new window in the computer admin panel. Double click Storage, double click Disk Management. It will list all the available visible drives on the system. The initialize drive window should pop up like this. Make sure GPT is ticked. If this window doesn't pop up, you can either go to the top here and select refresh or rescan disks, and it will research for more drives on the system. If you see the drive as you see here and it's not accessible, or all these options are grayed out like so, right click and select initialize disk. And then from there you can then follow up the pop-ups. Make sure you don't enable MBR, as this is where your OS is supposed to live, and if we're not using an OS drive, then that's a bad idea. So go ahead, click OK, and then from there we can now right click it. All the options are available. If you have multiple disks, you can then create a RAID. We're not going to do that. We're just going to create a nice simple volume for our tests. We're going to use the letter W for WD, give it a name. We're just going to call this one WD Black, and make sure we mention that this is indeed the Heatsink model. So again, we can go ahead, select finish, quick format, and the drive is now visible as an available drive. So for me, that means I can go ahead and start performing my tests. Now, throughout these tests, I'm going to be looking obviously at performance, sequential read, sequential write. I'm also going to be looking at IOPS at the 4K level. I'm also going to be monitoring the temperature. As you can see here, we're starting at 30, dipping into the 37 there in terms of temperatures. We're doing little tiny things with the drive. So at the end of the test, with 1 minute rest between each test, there's going to be around about 12 to 15 different barrage of tests, 3 for each program. So the first one is going to be Crystal Disk. Sorry if the screen went black there. That's just Windows asking for admin permission. I'm going to be doing 3 different test file sizes on the WD drive on Crystal Disk. I'm also going to be running Atto Disk Benchmark. And with Atto Disk Benchmark, 3 different formats there. Again, all of them on the WD drive. We're then going to be using AS SSD, another one. Again, 3 different file test sizes there on the WD drive. And finally, we're going to be running AJA. AJA, we're going to be running 3 different tests there, but again, concentrate on the graphs. Now, unfortunately, my capture card is being utilized by my PS5 system for a lot of our PS5 testing. Consequently, we are using OBS for this, but in order to make sure that performance isn't harmed throughout the course of our tests, I am going to disable OBS and then run the tests for about an hour, and then come back to you guys with all the results. You can check the time, it's all perfectly legit. We aren't going to be meddling with these results. We're just going to fast forward and see what the latest firmware update for WD Black's SN850, how well it's performing 1 year since release, and whether you should still buy this drive. Let's fast forward to the results. Right, so our testing has completed, and I've got to say, for the most part, the WD Black SN850 still holds up remarkably well. Even early doors, when I was looking at the temperatures that this SSD was hitting, we got a lovely consistent heat dissipation there throughout the course of our entire tests, living for the most part in the 40s there, even our most extensive testing, with the heaviest stuff here with Atto Disk Benchmark at the highest file size, only pipping slightly into the 60C. So again, lovely reports there in terms of heat dissipation on that thermal plate there. Now, if we look at the results themselves, it's worth highlighting WD's own reports here, and I've got to say, my PC, going by their data sheet, if their numbers are correct, which let's face it, it's been a year, if they weren't, we probably would have heard by now, I've got to say, I didn't crack 7,000 at any point. The closest I got was with regard to the Crystal Disk. I got as high as 6,925 sequential read there. IOPS very easily were broken into the 1 million there, something I saw consistently in a number of the testing, even the mixed testing, living at 700 and 800,000 respectively across the different file sizes, but still, I wasn't able to crack the 7,000 mark. Now, yes, they presumably tested it with some high-end Ryzen, maybe a Ryzen 7, or maybe some Xeon-powered architecture in their tests, but I will highlight in some of the other tests I performed previously, when I looked at SSDs like the Gamix, which uses the Integrate controller, I was able to break into the 7,000 mark there quite a few times and still get quite close to that 1 million. Again, the WD did do very, very well But I'm just surprised I wasn't able to hit that 7,000 mark on the WD in the way that I was in the likes of the ADATA Gamix and in other SSDs that I've tested previously that take advantage of the Phison or the Integrit controller. That's no short shrift that I'm dealing to the WD there, but I do think this is a case of how much is being done within these modern controllers that have been released in the 12 months since, and how easily or efficiently they're able to hit that 7,000 mark. Obviously the right figures there, the highest we got was 5,377 sequential write. That is on the 4 gig test file there, and again they reported it at a height of 5,300 there on the 1TB. So again, we're very much in the ballpark there, and the same goes for the IOPS there. Largely consistently accurate all the way through, it has to be said. So again, quite happy with that sequential performance there on Crystal Disk. But let's move away from the read-write performance in Crystal Disk and have a little look at something a little bit more analytical. Let's go straight over to Atto Disk Benchmark. Atto Disk Benchmark, again, you generally find, I would say, not hitting the same height, but the range of testing there does sometimes show off not only how well it does a certain SSD will do in different kind of I/O sizes, but also how well the SSD does with an oversaturated cache. So as we can see, the read performance there getting nice and high, capping maxing out at around 643 and 645 across all 3 file size tests there at a quarter of a gig, 1 gig and 4 gig. If we flick over to the IOPS there, we can see that the IOPS fairly respectable. Again, IOPS, this SSD did incredibly well, arguably higher than traditional throughput compared to the number of SSDs we tested in the past. Again, you got to look at this with perspective. This is an SSD that was released 1 year ago. It's incredible how high and how well this SSD performed in terms of IOPS. It's just a shame that that sequential write is a little lower than what a lot of the SSDs in recent months have put out. And again, we've got to look at this with relativity. We can't just judge it based on that. We've got to factor in 12 months since release. Now, if we move away from Atto Disk Benchmark, we can have a look at AS SSD. Generally more strict tool, it should be said, when it comes to a lot of the results. Obviously this is within the context of the file sizes we're looking at, but still, if we compare that against, let's go for a different SSD this time. Let's go for a Phison based controller SSD there. Let's go for perhaps the Titanium Micro. So if we look at the Titanium Micro there and switch out through and have a look how each reg compared, we can see by removing that there, comparing them against one another. We'll take a moment to reshape those on screen for you. We're able to see how well these compared in terms of traditional activity. So lining them all up like for like, we're able to see that across the board, that WD in terms of read absolutely nailed it. And a lot of that is to do with that high IOPS there in terms of the sequential. When it comes down to the 4K, and of course that's where IOPS once again really does do its best. We can see there that all the way through on the write performance, it still exceeded that. And that Titanium Micro is no slouch with a Phison E18 controller and with a reported write in the 6000s and a reported read in the 7000s, and being released 8 months later than the WD. It's good that the WD is still maintained and had a much higher score in AS SSD. If we, while remaining in AS, we can flick over to the IOPS performance there, and on each of these we'll flick over to their respective IOPS scoring. We can see again it being absolutely trounced in read IOPS there over that of the Titanium Micro, and the Titanium Micro did see dips where it was cache was being oversaturated, something that wasn't a problem there on the WD. That said, the write performance in terms of 4K IOPS was higher in the majority of tests using the Titanium Micro, and again that comes down to NAND distribution, I think, more than anything. And again, it once again highlights that the write speeds are the thing that have probably aged the least well in the last 12 months, with things like read performance and IOPS performance on the WD still doing incredibly well. So not something for the gamers to worry about, but maybe something that the editors of the world might, have a slight concern about. Now, if we move into AJ8, you can ignore the big numbers there. We're not going to be in any way focused on the big numbers because AJ8 does bombardment style testing, and therefore these numbers are not going to be consistent without the cache on the SSD overflowing. But as we look through, we can see the numbers are fairly consistently high. We can see in the 16 gig file, we saw the general level dip ever so slightly there. But again, maintaining a lovely height there all the way through in both read and write disk captures. Comparing it against the Patriot Viper there, we can have a look and bring up its own respective scoring there for AJ8. So if we bring that above each of them there and zoom in a little bit, we're able to see on all of those that score certainly ranked higher in both read and write captures there on the WD within each. So we're looking down there, we're comparing them against, and again, as we see, the numbers there higher on the WD, and finally on the 16 gig test file there with regards to read and write captures, again we saw higher numbers on that WD. So again, even 1 year on, those numbers are still ranking lovely and high for how well this drive performs. And again, all the way through that, once again to come back to it, because we were utilizing the version of this drive with the heatsink enabled, lovely temperature control all the way through the test, and ultimately for me confirming that this SSD is still very much worth your time 1 year since its release. And I'm kind of glad that WD haven't kind of rushed out a follow-up to it yet. I think the WD Black SN850 has still got a lot to give with or without that heatsink internally. And of course, if you are looking at this drive during certain sale periods, your Prime Days, your Black Fridays, your Cyber Mondays and more, this is a drive that is always on offer in those periods. WD are real hot on having a lot of their gamer architecture stuff be on these big sales. So if you do see this SSD on sale, unless you are a video editor or someone that needs to care a lot more about write IOPS or even write performance in general, it's still a fantastic SSD, and if you're a gamer, it's an absolute no-brainer. Be it PC or console gamer, the WD Black SN850 is still a kicker of an SSD at the end of 2021. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Do click like if you did. It helps me understand what I'm doing right and makes each video better than the last. If you want to learn more, click subscribe or the bell to be notified as we cover more on the subject of NAS, DAS, SSD, hard drives and more in 2021 and 2022, and take advantage of the free advice section over on NAS Compares. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.